Is it rolling? Okay, thank you, Arda. Go ahead. It's wonderful. I embarrass Arda every time I tell her that. Okay, so welcome back to HMR 1, Human Wrongs, Human Rights. And we have completed our section, our module on slavery and modern slavery. And we're moving on to the second element of this course, the discussion of the human wrong of colonialism. Now, colonialism is not something, I think you woke up this morning, when you're thinking about what you were going to dress up for Halloween this weekend. We're already wearing masks and getting our candy delivered to our homes. I don't know how much different it's really going to be. And we imagine that we live in a world relatively free from colonialism. And every once in a while we hear the word neo-colonialism spread around, but the reality of it is there are still colonies in this world, and our daily lives continue to be affected by the era of colonialism, by the ongoing, or what I call the lingering effects of colonialism, and an unwillingness or inability rather than inability, of those countries that once held colonies, the United States, Britain, Russia, France, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey as the Ottoman Empire, the inability of countries that once were major colonial powers to come to terms or to acknowledge the crimes against humanity that they committed and seek to make reparations for those crimes. So colonialism is very much with us. But colonialism is also, to some extent, the success story that slavery presented us with. Colonialism, like slavery, is now illegal. Where once it was widely practiced throughout the world, it is now considered a crime, an international crime under international law, and the world community, in the form of the United Nations, has created an enormous infrastructure, not only in the past to help with the elimination of colonialism, but to prevent it from happening again. I mean, we're not going to have colonies again, at least that's the plan. So colonialism, like slavery, has ended. But also like colonialism, there still are terrible effects. Just like slavery, there still are terrible effects, and there still are elements of contemporary human society that resemble an awful lot the kinds of exploitation and crimes against humanity that were present during colonialism. So what I want to do, though, is begin with helping us understand the broader context of colonialism. What time is this colonialism that we're talking about? Even what is this colonialism that we're talking about? Primarily by looking at a series of maps and a mystery presented by a series of maps. Then thinking about the 1960 Declaration ending colonialism, United Nations Declaration ending colonialism. And then, as we do a close reading of that document, bring out some of the key words and concepts that are an element of that, of colonialism, so that we develop our own sort of working vocabulary that we use as we move from today across the next 7 or 8 lectures. And then as we conclude, I want to propose to you 2 thesis statements and 2 questions to help us structure our work in section, as well as get ourselves ready for our second midterm examination, which I hope that we'll be able to get to the Friday before the week of Thanksgiving break. All right, I would invite you now to all go to your Slack channels and open up the document called Colonialism Mystery.pdf. The first page of it should look something like this. And what it will do is we'll slowly scroll through this map and begin to notice things about what's happening. And I'm doing this to help us lay the foundations for asking questions about why colonialism happened and then why it ended. All right, so let's begin. So the first of these maps is the year 1492, which every schoolboy and girl knows is when Columbus sailed the blue. This is a map that shows us primarily areas of of the states of Europe, but also the rising empires of Eurasia, the Ottoman Empire and the Empire of Muscovy, or Russia. These two empires would eventually spread to cover much of the Middle East and much of Asia, but it's the empires on the western side of these tiny little states on the western side of the Eurasian Empire that are most of interest to us right now. So mark the colors. You have the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, yellow, green, blue, and red. We move forward a little over 100 years, a little over a century. The map has changed a little bit for us. The map has changed with an enormous swath of yellow in the Western Hemisphere, North and South America. The yellow has spread over what are today the countries of Mexico, all of Central America, into the United States, many of the countries of the islands of the Caribbean, and then south into what was then the Incan Empire, and now are the countries of like Peru, Chile, Venezuela. And these were the enormous Spanish holdings just 2 generations after the arguments of the Sepulveda Las Casas debates. And then you can see on the littoral, or the coastline of what is now Brazil, the Portuguese presence. And one can wonder why, unlike the Spanish presence in the Western Hemisphere, which seems to have spread out over large territories, why is it that the Portuguese presence in South America seems only to be along the coastline? And perhaps the answer to that is, when one moves in from the coast in Brazil, then, but not so much today, one would have encountered very dense jungle. It would have been difficult to travel the Amazon, and most of what the Portuguese wanted to have access to was there on the coast. Colonialism is often a very pragmatic idea. It, at least until the end of the 19th century, it followed the resources, or in fact, and if those resources were human beings, it followed them. If you look in the Middle East and North Africa and Russia, you can see the growing again of both Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And then you see 2 other sort of outlying areas of green. One area of green in Southeast Asia, 2 actually. One in what it becomes East Timor in southern Indonesia. And then the Philippines, which has been occupied by Spain. And then in Africa, tiny little outposts, if you will, along the western coast of Africa and the southeastern coast of Africa. Places that would become Mozambique, Madagascar, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea-Bissau. These are places that eventually, these were many of the slave trading posts that had been established by the Portuguese in order to trade with slave traders, African slave traders, that were bringing human beings, but also other commodities from the interior of Africa to the coastline. Again, the Portuguese didn't colonize into Africa, to the interior of Africa, because they didn't need to. We'll fast forward a little bit, 200 years forward, to 1822. 1822, the map has changed. It's changed again in some very, very interesting ways. Also, our colors have changed a little bit, and some new states have been added to the mix. Russia, you see, has gone from sea to shining sea. In this case, the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean has created roughly the outlines of contemporary Russia, as well as many of the successor states of the USSR. And this is the great Soviet expansion throughout Siberia that comprised the conquest of many Turkic as well as Siberian peoples who have some kinship with the Arctic peoples of North America and Greenland. And Russia expanded following the resources of the Arctic and of Siberia, primarily natural resources like furs and ivory from mammoth. The Ottoman Empire expanded throughout the Islamic world, And eventually, with the exception of Iran, most major Muslim countries were under Ottoman domination, as well as much of southeastern Europe, which at the time was largely not Muslim, but rather Orthodox Christian. The United States has been established, and by 1822 is beginning its inexorable march towards between its two seas in a kind of policy called Manifest Destiny, all the while eating up indigenous land and dispossessing indigenous peoples, and similarly in British Canada. You can also see that Russia has begun to colonize parts of Alaska, what becomes Alaska, and in this era, the Russians even established a small presence in California at Fort Ross. But again, if we take a look at South America, the yellow and the green are gone. And this was an era when many of the South American Spanish colonies and Brazil were able to fight for their own independence. Now, these were not the indigenous peoples of these colonies fighting for independence. This is very similar to what would happen in the United States in the 1770s and 1780s, which was a fight by the colonists, people who had come from the old world, or people who were descended of people who had intermarried and had created families with indigenous people against Spain and the mother country, if you will, Spain, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. So these were new states that were founded primarily by settlers. But the most interesting expansion seems to be those expansions in the colors red and blue. Red being Great Britain, which seems to have colonized much of North America, little outposts in South America, outposts along the western African coast, much of South Africa, into East Africa, South Asia, and Australia. The British Empire used its mighty naval forces in this period and its commitment to exploration to begin to build an enormous trading empire, bringing primarily consumer goods like tea and later coffee to European and North American ports, while at the same time this is the era of growing industrialization and finished goods were making the return journey. We will talk a great deal about that in a subsequent lecture. Now, I invite you to move forward to 1885. 1885 is an important moment because it is right at the time of the Congress of Berlin, which again, we'll talk about a great deal. This is before the Europeans under the auspices of the Prime Minister of Germany sat down and looked at a map of the world and divided up those bits of it, primarily Africa, that were no longer under European colonial rule. If you look at 1885, 90% of Africa is still not under any form of European colonial denomination, although its trade and external relations with the outside world was largely negotiated through European trade. Spain in what is Morocco, the British and the French along the west coast of Africa and the Bight of Benin through to South Africa, even with a small German presence in Namibia, which those of you who follow genocide, this is also the era when the Germans committed genocide against the indigenous peoples of Southwest Africa. India is one of the few places where the British have sought to control beyond just the sea, as well as Australia. These are different places. In Australia, that control was being pushed by colonial settlement and even the settling of criminals from an overpopulated British Isles, whereas India, this was the final conquest of the Mughal Empire, one of the last great empires, the Mongols, that have been established in South Asia. Again, the Ottoman Empire still controls much of southeastern Europe, the Middle East, although Egypt has been taken by the British. Now, next. All right. This next map is the world in the months before the First World War, World War I. They did not call World War I World War I at the time. 1914, 1918. You can see in this map that Africa, if you toggle back and forth between the two maps, just over a 25-year period, and this map would have changed even sooner, just over a very short period of time, the map of Africa in particular has changed radically. There are very few gray spaces in Africa, gray designating independence, but the rest of it is either pink, red, blue, green, or yellow. Blue here is the French, the sort of burnt orange, peach, no longer red, is the British Empire, which really stretches almost uninterrupted from Alexandria in the north in Egypt to Cape Town in the south in South Africa, and with the new Italian colonies in the north in Libya and in Somalia, German colonies in West Africa, and right there in the middle, in the sort of dark color, is the Belgian Congo, which until the beginning of the 20th century was called the Congo Free State, and was primarily the personal property of the King of Belgium, King Leopold. We will spend a great deal of time using the Congo as a case study for our work on understanding the human wrong of colonialism. It's the setting for our graphic novel, but also an incredible response by the important West African writer Chinua Achebe. We'll also be, through this course, looking at one of those other great peach-colored spots, South Asia, and the independence movement of India, led by Mohandas K. Gandhi and the Congress Party. We'll also be thinking about one of these big blue spots there in the north of Africa. It looks kind of like a diamond shape. That's Algeria, one of the most populated and successful states of North Africa that had been a French colony beginning in the 1820s, but came under even more drastic and, I think that's not quite the right word, under a much heavier hand of colonial occupation during the 1920s, and then saw a very violent war for independence starting in the 1960s. So we'll look at that as well. And then one of the other cases that we examine takes place in the green areas, the partition of Palestine and the creation of Israel and Palestine, and the ongoing colonization of Palestine by the state of Israel. But you can look at this map, and many of the world's still areas facing terrible problems are those areas that were once blue or once orange. And that's one of the issues that we're going to be talking about throughout this course. Now, fast forward to 1945. What's happened between 1914 and 1945? Well, two great wars, World War I and World War II. In both cases, these wars were supposedly fought for ideas. In World War I, it was a war fought for national self-determination and the freedom of peoples from colonial rule, but only if they were in Europe. And in the Second World War, the fight against Nazism, against fascism, against oppression on behalf of democracy and liberation. Now, two of the great winners of both of those wars, Britain and France, did not see those wars as requiring them to liberate their own colonies, but in the period after 1945, both from within those colonies and from without, there would come inexorable pressure for them to divest themselves of what were often becoming very, very expensive overseas empires. If you look in this period, there are a few American empires, American colonial holdings abroad, and it's important to understand that the United States, beginning at the beginning of the 20th century and following the Spanish-American War, participated in colonialism, and it was, in some circles in the United States, represented, for example, by someone like Mark Twain, it was a very unpopular move. But the United States held colonies that it took from Spain in East Asia, in the Philippines, but also in the Caribbean, in particular Puerto Rico, which is still a colony that the United States possesses, as well as several small South Pacific islands. The most important of which in this period was Hawaii, which eventually became a U.S. state, and Alaska, which had been purchased from Russia at the time of the U.S. Civil War, which became a state at roughly the same time. And then if you move, though, from 1945 to the next map, which shows the world today, the blue bits have a different meaning, as do the pink bits in this map. Unfortunately, the legend on this map has dropped off, so I will interpret it for us. Blue designates those countries that achieved their independence through various means in the period between 1960 and 1989. So this is almost all of Africa, with the exception of those places that had already been independent, or in the case of South Africa, underwent tremendous political change, except for places like South Sudan and Eritrea, which became independent after 1989. In fact, that's what the pink on these maps represent, which is those states that became independent in the wake either of the revolutions of 1989 in Eastern Europe, in particular in the fall of the Soviet Union, or in Africa with a series of peace treaties following civil wars in Sudan and in Ethiopia, between Eritrea and Ethiopia. This map still does not show very well the remaining colonies, but you can see them, they're in gray. And the biggest of these, of course, is Greenland, in terms of territory but not population, Puerto Rico in the Western Hemisphere, two small French colonies off the coast of Canada, New Caledonia in the South Pacific. But by and large, and Rio de Oro, or the Western Sahara, which has been occupied by Morocco for 60 years, now. So this is an interesting final map to stop on. The process of decolonization and independence has continued, but it's very but in just a relatively short period of time, essentially between 1945 and really 1972, almost all the countries of the world that had, or areas of the world that had been under colonial domination, some of them from as far back as the 18th century, but most of them that had been colonized in the period of the scramble for Africa in the 19th century, had achieved their independence. And this, I've always thought, this sort of rapidity of change is something I sometimes think about in terms of many kinds of human rights revolutions, is that humanity sort of moves very sort of slowly through time, not wanting to adjust to new demands, and then something sort of grabs the collective imagination of humanity and pushes us through or over the fence or through the gate, whatever metaphor you want to use, to this process of decolonization. But again, we look at this map and we can sort of pat ourselves on the back. But there are still forms of colonialism that are out there. There's still, in the Middle East, in particular between Israel and Palestine, terrible problems created by the continuing occupation of Palestine by Israel. And there's also forms of neo-colonialism, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about. And then also just this unwillingness or failure on the part of former colonial governments to try to create systems that might repair the relationships or sort of repair, in terms of the word reparation and repair are very similar, aren't they? To repair the damage that they did and the extraction of resources that were so much part of the colonial enterprise with the countries that they once held under domination. Okay. So, what I'd like to, I would love to stop now and see if there are any questions, but what I want to do is help figure out why colonialism is wrong. Why is colonialism wrong? We went through this exercise with slavery. Why is slavery wrong? What does it do to the person? What does it do to society? And also thought about, why do people who are enslaved oppose being enslaved? Why do people who are not enslaved work hard to end slavery? So these are the same kinds of questions that we'll be asking about colonialism. And I think one of the best statements about why colonialism is a human wrong is contained within the document Making International Colonialism Illegal, which is the 1960 UN Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. Now, I've asked the TAs to post this as well in the Slack site, and I encourage you to go look at it. It's under the heading UN Dec Colo 1960.pdf. Just go ahead and take a moment and open that up. Never quite understood why UN documents that are PDF files are always at some kind of angle, but it makes them always seem more authentic to me. So, the Declaration of the Granting of Independence of Colonized Peoples was issued in 1960, which is only 15 years after the establishment of the United Nations, and only 12 years after the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which does not identify colonialism as a human rights violation, but is very clear that self-determination and democracy are critical human rights. So the way that these declarations and international treaties work in the UN is they have these interesting preambles, which use these sort of neat words, these neat carrying words like mindful and conscience and recognizing. Usually they're sort of gerunds. So they're fun to read, and I imagine that a great deal of effort goes into crafting these. So as you're opening them, let's look at these, and then I'm going to draw out from them after we finish some very critical terms. So, and these terms have already been posted, I believe, by your TAs into your Slack channels as well. So, mindful of the determination proclaimed by the peoples of the world in the Charter of the UN to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. This is what these preambles do, is they explain the reasons. And it's technically all one sentence, which, they should have, it's just all one sentence. So it's like, because of all these things, we will do this, is what it does. Conscious of the need for the creation. So the first one says, looking at colonialism through the lens of our contemporary world, where we're supposed to promote human rights, there's a problem. Conscious of the need to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being and peace and friendly relations based on respect for the principles of equality, rights, and self-determination of all peoples, and of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. We haven't studied this yet, but we will in the next section somewhat. Each one of these phrases and all of these words are taken directly from international human rights treaties that have been established by the United Nations, and in general signed by all the countries of the world, including those that held colonies. So these are their binding ideas, right? You're supposed to create peace and friendly relations. That's from the UN Charter, right? Self-determination of all peoples is something in the both in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which was agreed to in 1956, as are the following ideas: determination, fundamental freedoms for all without distinction of race, language, or religion. So again, it's understanding decolonization and the ending of this as a human rights issue. They recognize the yearning for freedom, aware of increasing conflicts. In other words, they're beginning to see that as peoples begin to demand independence, wars are following. In 1960, there's a war in Algeria and a war in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in French Indochina, that are raging, that really, and did, have incredible international implications. Right? The UN is considering the role of the UN. In other words, the UN also held territories, as you learned from reading the Toretta article in the last section. Oh, sorry, wrong course. I apologize for that. Trust territories, which were small islands in particular that the UN administered, as well as those areas that had been under German colonial rule. All people, recognizing that people of the world want to end colonialism, not just in colonies, but outside. Colonialism also prevents the development of international economic cooperation. This is in part because the French would not allow people in their colonies to trade openly, but only with France. So if you were in Algeria and you were making awesome Algerian wine, you couldn't sell it in the international market. You had to sell it to France. And this would become more important, especially as oil was being discovered in places like Algeria. So international cooperation, but also forms of development. Not just economic development, but the development of society and culture, right? Of the establishment of universities and colleges and schools, the creation of their own national sense of being. So believing that the process of liberation is irresistible and irreversible, and in order to avoid serious crises, an end must be put to colonialism and all practices of segregation and discrimination. In other words, that accompanying colonialism is often forms of racism, dehumanization, segregation, and discrimination. And finally, welcoming that many territories have gained their independence and the world has not fallen apart, which was sort of this is a sly argument against those countries that said if we give them independence, then everything will go to hell. And that convinced that all peoples have an inalienable right to freedom and sovereignty and the integrity of national territory, three concepts that are very important. The United Nations General Assembly jointly proclaims the necessity of bringing to a speedy and unconditional end colonialism in all its forms and manifestations. And we'll think about how that process worked or didn't work in subsequent lectures, but also the limited role that the United Nations played in it. So as I conclude, I want to focus again on some key words and ideas that we're going to use as part of our working vocabulary here, and also propose to you two thesis statements and two research questions. So the first is we have to define colonialism and how we're going to use it in this course. And really, we're looking at colonialism in the period of the middle 19th century until the middle of the 20th century, roughly a 100-year period. And so we talk about two kinds of colonialism in this period. The first and the most important is exploitative or exploitation colonialism, where there's an occupation done primarily to extract wealth or impose socioeconomic control or strategic control in an area. It wasn't about settling in those areas, it was about controlling and dominating and taking. There's also settler colonialism, which, for example, in HMR 134 right now, we're looking at South Africa, which is a settler colonial state. Australia is a settler colonial state. Israel is a settler colonial state. The United States is a settler colonial state. In other words, people primarily from Europe, but also from other parts of the world, moved to those areas, displaced the indigenous inhabitants to create a new country in their absence. We're not going to spend as much time on settler colonialism, but it overlaps primarily when we discuss Israel-Palestine and Algeria. So, some of the concepts that I want you to go over yourselves, and perhaps if you have a chance in your sections, are terms like self-determination, independence, what does it mean to be independent? The concept that colonialism is a threat to world peace, the concept of the trust territory, this idea that colonized people yearn for freedom. Why do they want it, right? Also, various kinds of development, not just economic development, but cultural and social development. What is that? The concept of the national control of natural resources. In other words, should natural resources that could make a country wealthy or self-sustaining, does a colonizer have the right to take that wealth? Irreversible liberation. In other words, this idea that human beings have this sense that they're always moving to liberate themselves and others, and that once it's happened, it can't be reversed. And then finally, the basic human and inalienable right. And I want you to notice that in the preambulatory statement, they used a phrase taken specifically from one of the most pertinent declarations of independence from a mother country, the Declaration of Independence, the inalienable right to freedom, sovereignty, and integrity. So work on these words, and they're in your Slack, and they will become important, not just so that we understand what we're talking about over the next 7 or 8 lectures, but also they'll be useful when you write your midterms. So here are the 2 thesis statements. Thesis 1. Many of the contemporary world's most challenging human rights problems can be traced to colonialism and the process of decolonization. I'm not going to reread it because it's already written down, but this is something to talk about amongst yourselves, but also in a section. Thesis 2, colonialism produces negative lingering effects on post-colonial societies. And this is an incredibly important idea that I want all of you to have a chance to think about. And here are a couple questions that I would ask you to pose to yourselves and your colleagues. Can former colonial rulers continue to propagate socio-economic and political activity in their old colonies without direct occupation? And if the answer is yes, I'd like us to figure out how. The second question is, what are the possible social, cultural, and economic impacts on metropolitan societies by formerly colonized peoples? What happens when colonized peoples move from India to the United Kingdom, or from the Philippines to the United States, or from Algeria to France? What does that mean? And are these impacts inherently negative? Okay. So on that note, I will conclude, and I will see you again on Wednesday. Thank you.